I'm the operations manager here at Politics and Prose. And I'm actually not here as much to introduce as to stand here in case to kind of be the body double. To kind of be the first guy out of the limo in case somebody's going to take a shot. It's actually in Jon Ronson's contract that we do have to have that here. When we first started talking about after Jon had agreed to come here, and we were talking about it, one of the owners of the store, and I'm not going to mention who, had a bit of a fit, claiming that this was pretty much one of the worst ideas for a novel she had ever heard of. And the events coordinator and I, both of whom had read them, and I had already had a galley in my hand, an advanced copy of it, and was reading it, started to explain to her that it wasn't fiction. And it took, I kid you not, a good 25 minutes to finally convince her, and I actually had to put the book in her hand to convince her of that. And it occurred to me then that if this was fiction, it would have be more unbelievable than the Da Vinci Code, in the sense everyone's like, boo. Is Dan Brown here? In the sense that it's amazing, and it's amazing up until you start to kind of put certain things in context. When you start to remember the $100,000 toilet seat, when you start to remember some of these things, and it kind of all lines up. And I think the best story about this book, this afternoon, I've read it, and a number of my floor managers have read it as well. And one of them came up to me probably an hour ago, and it's like, when can you give Jon Ronson a note? I have it in my pocket. And I was justifiably skeptical. And then he told me that Colonel Alexander, who appears in the book, had called the store this afternoon and said, have Jon send me a signed copy. And so we're just amazed by the fact that that they tracked him down. And it turns out... Yeah, it was a message. Yeah, basically. And since then, when we came in, someone else who's in the book is in the audience, and it's a little bit like old home week here. So without further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome tonight's author, a filmmaker and an author who we dearly, dearly love here at Politics and Prose, and we, in fact, need more of these books. Jon Ronson.
I can ask Simon & Schuster to ship you some more copies of the books. The Many Stoic Goats really begins with my first book, Them, and if you'll indulge me, because I've done so few readings from them in the US, in fact one, I'm going to read a little bit from it first, because I think it will explain a little bit about me and about why I ended up writing The Many Stoic Goats. Them was a book really about leaders of militant groups, Islamic fundamentalists. I'd spent a year with a man called Omar Bakri Mohammed, who called himself Osama bin Laden's man in Great Britain, although I'd noticed that he'd stopped calling himself that on September the 12th, 2001. I spent a year with him, and I spent a lot of time with a Ku Klux Klan leader who had banned his members from using the N-word. And he banned the robes and the hoods and kind of banned everything that was presumably fun about being in the Ku Klux Klan. And he'd replaced all those things with personality skills seminar workshops where all the Klansmen had to decide if they were sanguines or phlegmatics. I was a phlegmatic. Anyway, I thought that these people really had nothing much in common, but it turned out that they did have something in common. They all believed, much as like Osama bin Laden believes, and Eric Rudolph and Timothy McVeigh, that there was a shadowy cabal secretly ruling the world from inside a secret room. And they all started telling me this stuff, and I put it out of my mind, but then I just kept hearing it from Muslim fundamentalists and from neo-Nazis. So finally I said, well, tell me more about this shadowy cabal. And they said, oh, well, they're called the Bilderberg Group, and they always meet once a year in a 5-star hotel with golfing facilities, and that's where they secretly rule the world. And I said, well, do you know where they meet? And he said, no, but there's a man called Big Jim Tucker. He knows. He lives in Washington, D.C. So I phoned up Jim Tucker, works for a newspaper called The Spotlight. He'd made it his life's work to track down the shadowy cabal. I phoned him up and I said, is it true? And he said, yes, and you've caught me at a good time. I've discovered that the Bilderberg group are meeting at the end of May, beginning of June at the Caesar Park Hotel and Golfing Resort in Sintra, Portugal. And I fully intend to fly over there, climb up the drain pipes, get in and confront them red-handed going about their covert wickedness. So I said, can I come? He said, yes, you can, as long as you don't step on twigs when we're on the prowl. So we flew to Portugal. And I really thought it was nothing. I thought it was a shaggy dog story. But we went to the Caesar Park Hotel. I dutifully followed. And we scouted around, trying to form contacts with waitresses. This was the day before the shadowy cabal was supposedly arriving. And I was going to read a little bit from the book of what happened just after we scouted around the hotel. This is my telephone call to the British Embassy. I'm a journalist from London, I said. I'm calling you on the road from Sintra to Estoril. I'm being tailed right now by a dark green Lancia belonging to the Bilderberg group. There was a sharp intake of breath. Go on, she said. I'm sorry, I said, but I just heard you take a sharp breath. Bilderberg, she said. Yes, I said. They watched us scouting around the Caesar Park Hotel, and they've been following us ever since. We have now been followed for 3 hours. I wasn't sure at first, so I stopped my car on the side of a deserted lane, and he stopped his car right in front of us. Can you imagine just how chilling that moment was? This is especially disconcerting, because I'm from England, and I'm not used to being spied on. Do you have Bilderberg's permission to be in Portugal? She said. Do they know you're here? No, I said. Bilderberg are very secretive, she said. They don't want people looking into their business. What are you doing here? I am essentially a humorous journalist, I explained. I am a humorous journalist out of my depth. Do you think it might help if we tell them that? From the corner of my eye, I saw Jim wind down his window. He leant his head out and blew an antagonizing, ladylike kiss at the Lancia. Hold on a second, I said. Jim, I said sternly, please stop that. I lowered my voice. I'm here with an American, I said, called Big Jim Tucker. He's an agent provocateur. That might be the problem. Maybe you can phone Bilderberg and explain that I may be in the car with Jim Tucker, but I'm not actually with him. Listen, she said urgently, Bilderberg is much bigger than we are. We're very small. We're just a little embassy. Do you understand? They're way out of our league. All I can say is go back to your hotel and sit tight. This is what happened when we got back to the hotel. Sandra from the British Embassy called me on my cell phone to inform me that she'd spoken to the Bilderberg office at the Caesar Park, and they said that nobody was following us, and how could they call off someone who didn't exist? He is, I said in a staccato whisper, behind the tree. The good news, said Sandra, is if you know you're being followed, they're probably just trying to intimidate you. The dangerous ones would be those you don't know are following you. But this was scant comfort. What if these men were the dangerous ones, and I just happened to be naturally good at spotting them? What if I was adept at this? So it surprised me just how easily I slid into their bubble of illogicality, because really when you think about it, I was being chased by a couple of security guards, in dark glasses admittedly, who were there to protect a think tank meeting of powerful industrialists and bankers. I shouldn't have been so surprised, but instantly I began to think, it's true, the crazy people are right, they're onto something, and I slid into this bubble, and within this bubble of logic it all made absolute sense to me. I became one of the paranoid people. And then when I began to investigate these cabals, I discovered that they were basically nuts as well. They all go to this place called Bohemian Grove in Northern California, where they have these insane rituals where people like George Bush and Dick Cheney and Henry Kissinger dress up in robes and hoods and have a kind of mock human sacrifice where a papier-mâché effigy is thrown into the fiery belly of a 50-foot stone owl, which we secretly filmed and put out on British TV. And it was nuts. I mean, I was there with a right-wing conspiracy theorist who believed this was evidence of actual child sacrifice, and I came away thinking it was basically just a pageant. And the worst thing about it was that it was just so immature. But nonetheless, the people who attended the rituals seemed to take them just as seriously as the conspiracy theorists did. And I thought about that, and I wondered whether, under Clinton, the paranoid and crazy people were very much marginalised. They were in the woods in the Ozark Mountains and so on. But then, when Bush got into power after September the 11th, I began to wonder whether these bubbles of illogicality existed within powerful places too. And that was the question that set me on the road to writing The Men Who Stare at Goats. And it really began about 2 weeks after September the 11th, when I had lunch with Uri Geller. I just remembered Uri Geller after 9/11 because he'd always spoken about how he had been a secret psychic spy working for the CIA in the 1970s, and he'd tell people this all the time, and the journalists would, you know, report what he said and then add sarcastic asides. But I wondered whether maybe there was something in it. So I phoned him up. We had a little bit of a rocky relationship, me and Uri Geller. I don't know if I should tell you, I didn't put it in the book, but there's a backstory. Will I tell you the backstory? Okay, well about 10 years ago, Uri Geller announced that he knew where the Lost Ark of the Covenant was buried, and he was going to dig it up. And although I was a little concerned about, you know, when they started digging, you know, we'd have to avert our eyes lest we'd be turned to dust, I thought it might be good fun to go along. So I phoned him up and I said, do you mind if I come too? And we arranged to meet at his home in Sonning-on-Thames. And as I pulled into his village, my cell phone rang. I was about an hour early. And the voice said, John, it's Uri. If you haven't left your house yet, I was wondering, could you bring along? And I said, Uri, it's funny you should phone. I've actually just pulled up in your village. And Uri said, I knew it. I could feel it. That's why I phoned. Shippy, didn't I say I could feel John in the village? And I heard Shippy, Uri's brother-in-law. Yes, you did, Uri. Anyway, I wrote this up at the time and he was rather cross. And, but he agreed to meet me for lunch. And I'd done a little bit of search about the psychic spies, and it turned out that Uri really had been tested by the CIA. But he was kind of weird in the restaurant. He was wearing big wraparound mirrored sunglasses. 2 weeks after 9/11, every time a plane flew overhead, we all looked up. And I said, Uri, tell me about your days as a psychic spy. He said, I don't talk about it. I never talk about it. And I said, Uri, I've got a file an inch thick of you talking about it. And then suddenly, Uri took off his sunglasses and he looked me squarely in the eye. If you repeat what I'm about to tell you, he said, I will deny it. Okay, I said. It will be your word against mine, said Uri. Okay, I said. Uri moved his chair closer to mine. He glanced around the restaurant. This, he said, is no longer a history story. I'm sorry, I said. I have been reactivated, said Uri. What? I said. I looked over at Shippy. He nodded gravely. Uri, I said, please give me something to go on. Please tell me one more thing. Uri sighed. Okay, he said, I will tell you one more thing only. The man who reactivated me is called Ron. And that was it. Wouldn't tell me anything else. Wouldn't tell me if Ron was CIA or FBI. So I decided to go on a journey to find Ron. And I never found Ron. But what I did find was something a lot odder. And it was this. In 1995, the CIA declassified the fact that they had a crack team of secret psychic spies, which sounded incredibly glamorous, but it wasn't so glamorous. It was basically half a dozen soldiers sitting inside a condemned clapboard building at Fort Meade, Maryland, told by their commanding officers to try and be psychic. And they basically stayed in there for 23 years, and because they were black up, with no, you know, they didn't exist, they had no coffee machine. And you can imagine after 23 years that would really rankle. They had to bring their own coffee into work. And they never got repairs done, you know, on their building because they didn't exist. The building was supposed to be empty. But anyway, the CIA kind of declassified and shut them down in ignominy in 1995. And everybody went crazy for them, you know, the crack team of psychic spies. And nobody really thought maybe this was the tip of an iceberg. And it turned out it was. And the iceberg is what I write about in The Men Who Stare at Goats. And it turns out that there was a secret team of soldiers at Fort Bragg in North Carolina who had 100 goats. The goats had all been debleated, not so that the soldiers would need to learn how to cauterize the vocal cords of the enemy, which I don't think is something that, you know, could be deployable in a combat situation. But because they didn't want the local animal rights activists finding out that they had goats on base. So the goats were just standing there with their mouths opening and closing with no bleat coming out. Many of them had their legs in plaster. This is because they'd been shot in the leg and then nursed back to health in regular, conventional medical training programs. From time to time, the goats would all be herded into a room, and then somebody would throw in a hand grenade, and then they'd all rush in and, you know, and try and nurse the goats back to health. Terrible things are done to goats in the US military is the moral of this. But if that wasn't bad enough, in the early 1980s, and once again today, once they had all these goats on base, Special Forces decided to try and kill them just by staring at them. So they started staring. They got in martial arts experts from around America, including a man called Guy Savelli in Ohio, and they basically just stared at the goats. I managed to track down Guy Savelli, the goat stare. It was Colonel Alexander who eerily phoned this store this afternoon and told me about him. I phoned him up and I said, "Is it true? Did you ever manage to kill a goat just by staring at it?" He said, "Yes, it's true." I said, "I don't suppose you still practice the technique, do you?" He said, "Yep." He said, "Only last week I killed my hamster just by staring at it." And he said he'd videoed it, and I could come and watch the video if I wanted to. So I turned up at his martial arts and dance studio in Ohio. He showed me all the documentation of him at Special Forces at Fort Bragg, showed me photographs of soldiers in the act of karate chopping goats to death with the quivering palm, which is a martial arts technique where apparently you walk around for 24 hours and then drop dead. And then he showed me his hamster video. He was very suspicious of me, actually. They were looking, him and his son were filming me the whole time I was there, and they wouldn't. They thought, it turns out they thought I was Al-Qaeda. Well, when I'd phoned, they kind of thought, well, you know, how do we know he's not Al-Qaeda? So they phoned up Special Forces, and they said, there's this guy, you know, claims to be a journalist from England. He might be Al-Qaeda. Special Forces have said to him, meet him, film him, send us the film. We want to know what he looks like. And I think I've pinpointed at what moment Guy Savelli realised that I wasn't Al-Qaeda. And it was when I discovered that his daughter had danced with Richard Gere in the movie Chicago. And I kind of screeched, you know, I love Catherine Zeta-Jones in that movie. And I kind of figured that even a deep cover Al-Qaeda operative wouldn't think to go that effeminate. So that was the moment that Guy relaxed. So he showed me the hamster video. Now, on one level, this is basically a hamster in its wheel, with a guy staring at it and providing like an entirely random psychic narrative to this thing. Because he's basically saying, look, have you ever seen a hamster act like that? I don't own a hamster. I've never owned a hamster. I do not know how they behave. I do not know whether or not it was abhorrent behaviour. It did stand very, very still for a long time at one point, and then the other hamster, which was the control hamster, climbed on top of it. And I kept on saying to Guy, am I going to see it die now? Yeah, just wait, it gets weirder. Anyway, then the tape ended, just as the hamster gets up and brushes itself down and starts eating. So it's a very inconclusive video. Later, Guy told me that the reason why he didn't want me to see the bit where the hamster actually dies is because he was afraid I was a bleeding heart liberal and would take it out of context. But he assured me that the hamster did die. More recently, a few months ago, I got a very excited telephone call from Guy Savelli. He'd had a call from Special Forces because the goat and the hamster staring experiments had taken place in the early 1980s, around 1982, 1983. But in 2004, Guy was phoned out of the blue from Special Forces, and they wanted him to go down to Fort Bragg with an animal. And I said to Guy, is it a goat? And he said, no. And I said, what kind of animal was it? He said, I'm not going to tell you. And I said, was it a small animal, cheap to purchase? Guy said, yes. I said, was it a hamster? Guy said, I can neither confirm nor deny that. Turns out that the reason why they're doing the staring again now is because they don't want to kill a hamster anymore. What they want to do is learn the art of the stare, that if you can really freak out a hamster, that you can really freak out a subject of interrogation at a prison camp in Iraq. So they're teaching the interrogators the art of the stare with Guy Savelli. Back in the 80s, they were trying to actually kill them, and at one point, by Guy's account. See, all the videos are inconclusive. Each time, you know, you've got a goat strapped up to an ECG machine. The camera zooms into the machine. You hear a soldier off camera saying, "He's down," but the camera never pans out again, so you never see it. So, so even though I've seen 3 videos shot at Fort Bragg with these experiments, I've never actually seen any animal fall over. But at one point, apparently, they put 30 goats in a room. They put numbers on each of the goats. Guy was staring at goat number 16, and goat number 17 fell over, which I guess is collateral damage. So obviously I was curious to know how all this came to be. And it turns out it was all because of one man, a remarkable and really quite wonderful lieutenant colonel called Jim Channon. Jim was in Vietnam, and he realised that his men were being killed because they impulsively and kind-heartedly fired high, missing the enemy. They just weren't cunning. The Viet Cong, they were cunning, but not the Americans. And so after the Vietnam War, Jim wrote to the Pentagon. He said he wanted to teach the American army how to be more cunning, and would they fund him on a 2-year odyssey where he would learn these things. So the Pentagon agreed. And Jim spent 2 years in California, amongst the emerging New Age human potential communities of California. He never told them how the ideas that he was picking up there in his naked hot tub encounter sessions and so on could be adapted to teach a battlefield soldier how to be more cunning. But after 2 years, he came back with a manual, and it was called the 1st Earth Battalion Operations Manual. And it was a redesign of every aspect of military life. In the 1st Earth Battalion, soldiers would carry baby lambs into hostile countries, and they'd place the lambs down on the ground, and with sparkly eyes, they'd give the enemy an automatic hug. Now, if that wasn't enough to pacify the enemy, the soldiers would have loudspeakers attached to their uniforms, and these loudspeakers would emit indigenous music and words of peace. And if that wasn't enough, the music would then be switched to broadcast discordant sounds, like acid rock music out of sync. And as we know from recent events, the idea of blasting detainees with discordant sounds is one of Jim's legacies, very much alive today. They're blasting Barney the Purple Dinosaur at insurgents in Al Qaim and Fleetwood Mac and Metallica and so on. So that's one of Jim's legacies that's alive today in the War on Terror. Anyway, the Pentagon was my guess is that at any other time they would have laughed him out of the room. But I think it wasn't just individual soldiers who were traumatized after Vietnam. I think the army as a machine was melancholy and in a funk and just wanted to be comforted by something that was nice. And they really embraced Jim's ideas. They instantly offered him the chance to set up a real 1st Earth Battalion where soldiers, one of Jim's biggest ideas was that soldiers would learn how to pass through walls. They would learn how to walk through walls. So they offered Jim the opportunity to try and get soldiers to do that. But Jim said no. Jim was kind of a pragmatist, and he realised that these ideas were good on paper, but not necessarily achievable in real life. He said no, he wanted his manual to float out there, and wherever it took root, that person would be a member of the 1st Earth Battalion. And because the army is full of... I think Jim wanted people to strive for the impossible, but find a greater level of human potential. But because so many of Jim's superiors were literal-minded men, they actually tried to walk through their walls. And The Men Who Stare at Goats opens with General Stubblebine III, the commander of military intelligence between 1980 and 1983, getting up from behind his desk and jogging to his wall. He's thinking to himself, what is the atom mostly made up of? Space. Now, to me, the key word in this is mostly. What am I mostly made up of? Atoms. All I have to do is merge the spaces. The wall is an illusion. Am I destined to stay in this room? No. Bang. Bumped his nose. And he was confounded by his continual failure to pass through his wall. And he eventually went to Special Forces at Fort Bragg. He kind of thought he had too much in his in tray, being commander of Army Intelligence, to do this. So maybe special forces would be able to do it. And it was he who put into special forces the idea that they should try and kill animals just by staring at them. So that was, that's how the 1st Earth Battalion, that's how this think tank idea floated into the fabric of the military. General Stubberbind was moved by the manual. He went to Fort Bragg. He suggested it to Fort Bragg. Fort Bragg tried it out. And then in the early 80s, it kind of died down. Excuse me. But obviously I was fascinated to know how these ideas live on today in the War on Terror. And the second half of the book is my journey to try and find that out. And I'm going to read one little bit from the book. Because I met a man called Pete Brusso. Pete trains martial arts. He trains the Marines in martial arts techniques. And he's a great fan of the 1st Earth Battalion. The 1st Earth Battalion, remember, was all about teaching the American soldier to have inner peace, to be wonderful. I think the first line of the manual was the American Army has no... What was the first line of the manual? Here we go. The first line of the manual was, the US Army doesn't really have any serious alternative than to be wonderful. And then disclaimer read, this does not comprise an official position by the military as of now. But then over the years, I think, as the Army recovered its strength after Vietnam, they began to see that Jim's ideas could be used to hurt people rather than heal them. And those are the ideas that live on today. And I'm just going to read a little bit, and then I think maybe we should move on to questions. From Pete Brusso. Pete teaches martial arts to the Marines. Pete is a pragmatist. He's an admirer of the 1st Earth Battalion, but he's taken it upon himself to adapt Jim's ideas into practical applications for the battlefield Marine. I asked Pete to give me an example of a practical application. OK, he said, there's a gang of insurgents standing in front of you. You are alone. You want to dissuade them from attacking you. What do you do? I told Pete I didn't know. Pete said that the answer lay in the psychic realm, specifically the use of visual aesthetics to instill psychically in the enemy a disincentive to attack. Can you be more explicit, I asked. OK, said Pete. What you do is you grab one of them, rip out his eyeballs and stab him in the neck. The blood squirts out like a fountain, really a fountain. Get the blood to spurt all over his friends. I should explain that Pete was saying this in a slightly less effeminate manner. Just punish the bejesus out of him right there in front of his friends. OK, I said. Or go for the lungs, said Pete. Create a gaping chest wound. What you have then is lots of sucking in air and lots of frothing. Or scrape a knife across the face. Here's a clever thing. Get your knife inside the clavicle. That's the collarbone. Once you're in there, you can scrape most of the tissue away from that side of the neck. Separate his brain stem from the back of his neck. Doesn't take much movement, physics-wise. Pete paused. What I'm doing, you see, is creating a powerful visual psychic disincentive for the other insurgents to attack me. Pete turned his music up loud. That, sir, I shouted. What? Shouted Pete. Broad interpretation of Jim's ideals, I yelled. Pete turned his music down again and shrugged as if to say, there you go, that's warfare. Now, my belief is that these ideas live on in such a way that is very representative of the way that the military works. It's a think tank. When the Abu Ghraib photographs came out, everybody was asking the question, who gave the orders? How high up does this go? I think it was the wrong question. I think you need to look at what happened at Waco, Texas, to understand what happened at Guantanamo Bay and at Abu Ghraib. And basically, these are like laboratories. It's very, very rare that the US Army has the opportunity to have a bunch of people surrounded. They try stuff out. This is out. This is why some of Jim's ideas, like the musical torture and so on, these half-remembered ideas from think tank meetings of days gone by, these ideas that have sort of stuck and festered in the dingy and unsatisfactory world of the theoretical, and suddenly they've got an opportunity to try this stuff into, to put this stuff into practice. And at Waco, instantly, they were trying out all these crazy ideas. They flew in a Moscow scientist who was an expert in subliminal sounds, which was another one of Jim's ideas. They were going to get Charlton Heston to play the voice of God and mix it underneath Nancy Sinatra, which they were blasting at the church. And Charlton Heston would, presumably say, "This is God, surrender." And the only reason why it didn't happen was that PSYOPs, who were in charge of this, and Colonel John Alexander, who phoned this store earlier, was in charge of this. They wanted the Moscow scientist Igor Smirnov to take full responsibility if anything went wrong, and Igor Smirnov refused, so they never put that into practice. But what you see is all these non-lethal technologies, you see all these kind of nutty ideologies, all battling for supremacy like a kind of casserole of ideas outside the church at Waco. And from the former detainees at Guantanamo Bay I've interviewed, it seems that exactly the same thing was going on there. I said to a man called Jamal Al-Harith, how do you feel? How did you feel at Guantanamo Bay? He said, I felt like a laboratory rat. He said, I felt that they were trying stuff out on me. And we know that the history of the army, I mean, in this room is Eric Olson, whose father was victim to two of these think tanky ideas, one known as MK Ultra, where they would put LSD into the Cointreau of unsuspecting guinea pigs, and Eric's father was one of those people. And also another think tanky program called Artichoke, where they would inject heroin into the people they were detaining and then withdraw them, and they were testing out cold turkey techniques and so on, and Eric's father got mixed up in that. Eric's father ended up being, the CIA say that he was inadvertently spiked with LSD and he had a bad trip and he jumped out the window. But Eric spent the last 50 years investigating and has come to the conclusion that his father was pushed out the window because he was involved in another one of these esoteric think tanky ideas where people died, and he was going to spill the beans. He had a crisis of conscience like Martin Luther, and so they threw him out the window. So the history of the military, when you look at those Abu Ghraib photographs, I think you don't see holiday snaps. What you see is the result of ideas, like the ideas that began with the 1st Earth Battalion, that have become skewed and distorted over 3 decades into something that can destroy people rather than heal them. And one example is with Barney the Purple Dinosaur. When it was announced a year ago that they were rounding up prisoners of war in Iraq and blasting them with Barney the Purple Dinosaur, it was treated as a funny story because, by all the major news networks in America, we've all had to listen to Barney, those of us who've had kids, torture's not that bad. It was disseminated as a funny story because who wants to replace a funny story, as Eric once said to me, with a story that's not fun? And in fact, I'm going to read one more tiny bit from this before we move on to questions. I was given 7 photographs of a detainee who'd just been given the Barney treatment, as they called it. It's 48 hours of Barney with a flashing strobe light inside a shipping container in the desert heat. I mean, this was the funny story of the war. I once did an event with Faye Weldon, and she said to me, you should put little yellow post-it notes in the bits where you want to read. And I thought, don't be crazy. What do you know, Faye Weldon? Okay, so this is a description of the photograph of the man who'd just been given the Barney treatment. Another modern-day incarnation of the ideas that began in this rather lovely Californian way with the 1st Earth Battalion. The detainee is inside the shipping container. He is barefoot. A thin plastic strap binds his ankles and he's crouched in the corner up against the silver corrugated wall. The metal floor is covered with brown dust and pools of liquid. Right at the back of the shipping container, deep in the shadows, you can just make out the figure of another detainee lying in a huddle on the floor, his face masked by a hood. Now the rag only covers the first man's eyes, so you can only see his face, which is deeply lined like an old man's, but his wispy moustache reveals that he's probably around 17. He's wearing a torn white undershirt covered with yellow and brown stains. There's an open wound on one of his skinny arms, and above it someone has written a number with a black marker pen. He might have done terrible things. I know nothing about him other than these 7 fragments of his life, but I can say this. In the last photograph, he is screaming so hard it almost looks as if he's laughing. Anyway, on that cheery note, any questions?
John, if you could just have people step up to the microphone.
Oh yes, if you have questions, would you step up to the microphone? Hi.
Hi, I'll start first. Listening to you talk, and I heard you on the Kojo and Andy show earlier today, so it was very interesting. The conclusion I draw is that you seem to say that there's really no real distinction between, say, what the U.S. military are doing in terms of experiments and perhaps what the Nazis did during the Second World War, the horrible experiments we've heard in the concentration camps, you know, the Joseph Mengele. Not to forget also that this kind of research, as I understand it, and I think Geller is one of the people that's talked about it, the Soviets were certainly doing something like that, and I believe the Chinese also, and Saddam Hussein, for all I've heard about. Do you draw any moral distinctions in terms of the motivations between, say, what the American military might be doing? And my follow-on to that question is, you mentioned earlier that there was no sense of hierarchical responsibility for this. Do you conclude that the higher levels of the military, say at the very highest senior levels, or members of Congress that supervise the military establishment, condone this, or they're simply out to lunch and don't know about this?
Well, in answer to your first question, I do see a distinction, because I think at the heart of even the most grotesque of the abuses in Iraq is, in their minds, it's better than killing people. And the whole point of the 1st Earth Battalion was, it was a very warm-hearted endeavour. It was all to do with averting future wars. It's got skewed and distorted by, you know, I used to think the American soldier, but now I think human nature, into something that can be used to shatter rather than heal. But it was a very positive and warm-spirited. The people in this book, I don't think essentially are baddies. I think the people in this book are goodies. There are exceptions, and the main exception is the case of MK Ultra and Operation Artichoke, which I hope he doesn't mind me just constantly pointing at him, but which Eric's father was a victim to. I mean, that's one example of a time when it manifested itself in a very un-warm-hearted manner. But in general, these are people trying to do good. And I'll give you one example. One of Jim's ideas was that military scientists should journey to the furthest corners of their imagination in a quest to invent a new kind of weapon that was big-hearted and non-lethal. Now, some of the weapons that they invented were kind of nuts. I mean, there's the gay gas. Do people know about the gay gas? They'd spend a lot of time and money on this. You'd drop a gas on the enemy that would turn them gay. And at the same time, you'd drop a halitosis gas. So the enemy would be both attracted to one another and also repelled. And they'd be so freaked out by this that the Americans would just go in and take over without anyone getting hurt. So they spent a lot of time on the gay bomb. They spent a lot of time on the sticky foam, which was in the Hulk movie, if anybody's seen that. It was the only thing that could stop the Hulk for a while. But it was a real thing, the sticky foam. It was basically a fire extinguisher, and you'd spray it and it would envelop somebody with foam, and then they'd be frozen to the spot. And this was actually deployed in Somalia, yet another real-life incarnation of the 1st Earth Battalion. The Somalis were trying to get to the food, and some kind of riot broke out. So they released the sticky foam, and they sprayed it as a wall. They didn't spray it onto the Somalis, they sprayed it as a wall between the Somalis and the food. And the Somalis all stood there, kind of waiting for it to harden, looking a bit befuddled, and then they climbed over it and carried on rioting. So that was the first and last time that the sticky foam was ever deployed in a combat situation. There's the hologram of Allah they've been attempting to develop. These are all ideas nurtured by this Colonel Alexander, as a result of being inspired by Jim Channon and the 1st Earth Battalion. The hologram of Allah would be projected over an enemy capital, and presumably Allah would then say, it turns out that America isn't the great Satan, I guess. But then there's some real-world incarnations of this work done by Colonel Alexander as a result of the 1st Earth Battalion, and one of them is the taser gun. The taser gun was nurtured into being by the Colonel, and I mean, I know it's a controversial weapon and people have died, but imagine how many lives have been saved as a result of the taser gun. So no, I see this book as a book full of good people, in the same way that I see them as being a book which de-demonizes the demons. And in response to your second question, it's a tricky one to answer. The current Chief of Staff of the US Army is a man called General Pete Shoemaker, who is a great friend and fan of Jim Channon and the 1st Earth Battalion, and he was brought back from retirement by Donald Rumsfeld, and he's well known to have an interest in these paranormal, esoteric military pursuits. He was at Fort Bragg around the time, commanding Special Forces when they were staring at goats. He's brought Jim back from retirement to teach majors some of the 1st Earth Battalion techniques. So now is a time when I know that these ideas go to the very top. The Abu Ghraib photographs, all you can do is hazard a guess. I mean, Lindy England, you know, the young girl in the photographs, has always asserted that they weren't holiday snaps, they were, you know, military intelligence, which is, you know, where these ideas really take root. Said, you know, keep going, it's getting what we need, it's getting what we need. But my guess is that, as I say, it's places like Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, are a casserole of ideas where people are desperately trying to get elbow room to try the thing that they remember from the think tank meeting of 15 years ago out. Middle-ranking people. Any other questions?
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Let somebody else.
Thanks.
You know, it's very hard to believe as you read that this is, or any of it is actual. It just has the feel of a put-on. That's so bizarre, right? Okay, I accept that it's actual.
Can I say that's because we still invest in our leaders some kind of sagacity and rational thought? And in fact, this book is saying, that, you know, is it such a surprise that they're just as nuts as we are?
Well, I don't invest any trust in our leaders and think of them as sagacious, but,
But
I don't know.
You know what I mean?
The follow-on to the question about the benign intent of the people who are doing this, to me that sounds absurd. There's always a certain benignity when people decide to kill other people to win. Sherman in the Civil War invented the idea of attacking the civilian population to persuade the sons and mothers and daughters of the Confederacy not to support the war. Grant decided to kill a lot of people, just calculating that he could kill more people than they could, right? Quite a separate idea is written about in a book called The Sociopath Next Door that just came out and is available here, in which the author claims that 4% of the population are sociopaths. What is the likelihood of these people ending up in those positions? Because the essence of the whole thing is to be able to kill somebody, destroy somebody, defeat somebody, hurt somebody without feeling guilty or responsible.
Well, in terms of how benign and how malignant these ideas are, these specific ideas began in a benign place. There's no doubt about it. The people, the gurus and the shamans in the early 1980s who brought these paranormal pursuits into the military and intelligence communities were doing it in a benign manner. Now, when a more malevolent person gets hold of these ideas and sees that they can be twisted and used in a malevolent manner, they become malevolent. But, you know, the introduction into the military of these ideas were done from a benign place. Hi.
First of all, I'd like to say I'm very impressed by the book, and I thought you gave a great presentation.
Oh, thank you very much.
Voice holds out. I did want to mention, first of all, there's a website I just found out about called educate-yourself.org that has a lot of scientific links and papers presented about the MK Ultra and the especially what the Kinnecom group at National Security, no such agency at Fort Meade, does. And they talk about using the ELF and the infrasound and using cell phone transponders, the upside down antennas, to beam certain frequencies that cause disabling, whether calcium channel efflux in your body, immune weakening, disease states, paranoia. They've isolated brainwave patterns of psychopaths, and they sort of broadcast them through to try and infect healthy people. As a tip of the iceberg, I've seen certain things through this. They also talk about the connection with Wilhelm Reich and how the cell phone, based on why. But there's also a thing, when you mentioned the mock human sacrifice, now I can't say what happens at Bohemian Grove, but just here in Washington, I know for a fact that there have been black masses done. The one you heard about, a kayaker, the guy was right here by Montrose Park off MacArthur Boulevard. He was digging, his dog took a dump and dug up this human skeleton they later identified as a kayaker. So, we're supposed to believe that a kayaker drowned in the middle of the forest 400 yards from the water. I'm not going to tell you who I know, whose basement it happened in. I'm not going to get into any of that, but I'm just going to say it's the most sick individual thing. And also one more thing I'd like to add was that there were the Gellin org that exfiltrated the rat line, the 300,000 of the worst Nazis, including Mengele. Many of them were brought in through the CIA. And they still, this guy, Pero, P-E-R-O, has a section on that site. And he talks about his case, but I don't know how accurate his is, but worth reading anyway. These Nazi networks were brought in, to our CIA, and this is all public record. It's been documented. And unfortunately, these are the people who've taken technology such as radionics, which are originally a wonderful healing technology, and turned them into a remote killing technology.
Well, of the things you spoke of, the one that I have some knowledge of is the frequencies, and you can follow a trail of patents like footprints in the snow, and the patents sometimes vanish into the world of military classification. And there's many patents brought out by a man called Oliver Lowry, Dr. Oliver Lowry from Atlanta. I turned up at his house one time, and he really freaked me out, actually. So we know that these patents have been brought up by the military, and the detainees at Guantanamo I've spoken to speak of being blasted with frequencies, put inside music, high and low frequencies, masked with music. I think there's no doubt that they're experimenting with this stuff. To add a controversial suggestion, I think there's a good chance that even though they're trying this stuff out, it's not necessarily true that it works. A lot of this stuff doesn't work. This may or may not work, I don't know.
I do know there's also these psychotronic generators, and unfortunately they can be used to amplify the power of those who aren't martial art masters, just satanic perverts, and they amplified enough to, I don't know how successful it has been, but they tried to give basically non-masters the power to kill somebody with a psi generator. And unfortunately, that's a whole other story. I don't want to,
Thank you. Any other questions? Right.
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this in a question, but I'll try. I didn't read your first book. I have read this one. And it seems that a lot of people are going, I can't believe what I'm reading, or I can't really believe this. It seems there's a huge absurdist factor in a lot of what you do. And so some people have almost labeled you as humorous in your depiction of this stuff. And I notice a lot of your writing is tinged with humor, but always comes back to a serious point.
Because I think we can be absurd. I think absurdity is a very natural human character trait.
I'm trying to think of how to phrase it as a question, but the question is, do you think the humor in your work comes from the absurdness of the human race and how all these things are implementing, and that's just your funneling of the facts, or do you use it as a coping mechanism because some of the stuff is so disturbing if you sort of stop and look at it out of context that the only way to deal with it is to laugh?
I think a bit of both. But when stuff when the story turns dark, I take the jokes out, and I did that in my first book too. In them, I mean, there's my section about what happened to the Weaver family up in Idaho. Is no laughing matter. That's one of the places where the conspiracy theories come true, when the FBI will surround a family and shoot a mother in the head and a young child. That's the kind of place where the crazy people suddenly don't seem so crazy, and where the government begins acting like a kind of grotesque caricature of the way that the conspiracy theorists see them. But in general, I like to find humour in situations, humour and absurdity. I consider myself, a vaguely absurd person. I don't distance myself from the people I write about, because I think we're all capable of getting into one of those bubbles of illogicality where within the bubble it all makes absolute sense, but from the outside. There's a chapter in them about David Icke, who goes around the world saying that the shadowy cabal are actually 12-foot lizards who've taken human form. And then you've got the Anti-Defamation League and various other anti-racist groups saying, well, when David Icke says that 12-foot lizards rule the world, he's actually using code. And what he means is that Jews rule the world. And David Icke says, no, I really do mean lizards. The ADL say, well, that's code too. And, I challenge anyone to spend 3 or 4 weeks with David Icke on the road and not come away thinking just a little bit that maybe 12-foot lizards do rule the world. And, of course, both belief systems. He really does mean lizards. Both belief systems are just as nuts as each other. So, I find that absurdity and embarrassment are, quite often as powerful guiding forces in life as love and tragedy, speaking personally. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
I mean, mine manifests itself in really dull domestic ways. If I can't reach my wife on the phone, it's clear that she's fallen downstairs and my son is now reaching up for the flex of a newly boiled kettle.
Okay. Thank you for the... I'm sorry, it wasn't a better phrased question, but thank you for the
Okay.
response.
Oh, no, but thank you.
All right, I'm going to be the bad guy and turn it over to the signing. I'd like to thank Jon for coming. You can applaud, it's fully acceptable.
Thank you.
Now, just one quick thing, the evil cabal of retail must take over. As I point out that we have copies of The Men Who Stare at Goats and Jon's first book, Them.
Oh, good, good.
Adventures with Extremists up front. And actually, when it first came out, it was one of our staff picks as well.
Oh, thank you. Can I just say how glad I am to see that yours seems so nice? When I was coming here, I was thinking I must be talking to those fat cats from Washington, D.C. I've heard so much about. But actually, yours seem to be lovely. I guess this isn't... Right.
Yeah. And Jon is available to, shake hands, kiss babies, and sign books. We dearly, dearly love here at Politics and Prose, and we, in fact, need more of these books. Jon Ronson.
I can ask Simon & Schuster to ship you some more copies of the books. The Men Who Stare at Goats really begins with my first book, Them, and if you'll indulge me, because I've done so few readings from them in the US, in fact one, I'm going to read a little bit from it first, because I think it will explain a little bit about me and about why I ended up writing The Men Who Stare at Goats. Them was a book really about leaders of militant groups, Islamic fundamentalists. I'd spent a year with a man called Omar Bakri Mohammed, who called himself Osama bin Laden's man in Great Britain, although I'd noticed that he'd stopped calling himself that on September the 12th, 2001. I spent a year with him, and I spent a lot of time with a Ku Klux Klan leader who had banned his members from using the N-word. And he'd banned the robes and the hoods and kind of banned everything that was presumably fun about being in the Ku Klux Klan. And he'd replaced all those things with personality skills seminar workshops, where all the Klansmen had to decide if they were sanguines or phlegmatics. I was a phlegmatic. Anyway, I thought that these people really had nothing much in common, but it turned out that they did have something in common. They all believed much.
Is Dan Brown here? In the sense that it's amazing, and it's amazing up until you start to kind of put certain things in context, when you start to remember the $100,000 toilet seat, when you start to remember some of these things, and it kind of all lines up. And I think the best story about this book, this afternoon, I've read it, and a number of my floor managers have read it as well. And one of them came up to me probably an hour ago, and it's like, when can you give Jon Ronson a note? I have it in my pocket. And I was justifiably skeptical. And then he told me that Colonel Alexander, who appears in the book, had called the store this afternoon and said, have John send me a signed copy. And so we're just amazed by the fact that that they tracked him down. And it turns out... Yeah, it was a message. Yeah, yeah, basically. And since then, when we came in, someone else who's in the book is in the audience, and it's a little bit like old home week here. So without further ado, it's my distinct pleasure to welcome tonight's author, a filmmaker and an author who we...
Which is like Osama bin Laden believes, and Eric Rudolph and Timothy McVeigh, that there was a shadowy cabal secretly ruling the world from inside a secret room. And they all started telling me this stuff, and I put it out of my mind, but then I just kept hearing it from Muslim fundamentalists and from neo-Nazis. So finally I said, well, tell me more about this shadowy cabal. And they said, oh, well, they're called the Bilderberg Group, and they always meet once a year in a 5-star hotel with golfing facilities, and that's where they secretly rule the world. And I said, well, do you know where they meet? And he said, no, but there's a man called Big Jim Tucker. He knows. He lives in Washington, D.C. So I phoned up Jim Tucker, works for a newspaper called The Spotlight. He'd made it his life's work to track down the shadowy cabal. I phoned him up and I said, is it true? And he said, yes, and you've caught me at a good time. I've discovered that the Bilderberg Group are meeting at the end of May, beginning of June at the Caesar Park Hotel and Golfing Resort in Sintra, Portugal. And I fully intend to fly over there, climb up the drain pipes, get in and confront them red-handed going about their covert wickedness. So I said, can I come? He said, yes, you can, as long as you don't step on twigs when we're on the prowl. So we flew to Portugal. And I really thought it was nothing. I thought it was a shaggy dog story. But we went to the Caesar Park Hotel. I dutifully followed. And we scouted around, trying to form contacts with waitresses. This was the day...
I'm the operations manager here at Politics and Prose. And I'm actually not here as much to introduce as to stand here in case to kind of be the body double, to kind of be the first guy out of the limo in case somebody's going to take a shot. It's actually in Jon Ronson's contract that we do have to have that here. When we first started talking about, after Jon had agreed to come here, and we were talking about it, one of the owners of the store, and I'm not going to mention who, had a bit of a fit, claiming that this was pretty much one of the worst ideas for a novel she had ever heard of. And the events coordinator and I, both of whom had read them, and I had already had a galley in my hand, an advanced copy of it, and was reading it, started to explain to her that it wasn't fiction. And it took, I kid you not, a good 25 minutes to finally convince her, and I actually had to put the book in her hand to convince her of that. And it occurred to me then that if this was fiction, it would have be more unbelievable than the Da Vinci Code, in the sense, everyone's like, boo.
Before the shadowy cabal was supposedly arriving. And I was going to read a little bit from the book of what happened just after we scouted around the hotel. This is my telephone call to the British Embassy. I'm a journalist from London, I said. I'm calling you on the road from Sintra to Estoril. I'm being tailed right now by a dark green Lancia belonging to the Bilderberg Group. There was a sharp intake of breath. Go on, she said. I'm sorry, I said, but I just heard you take a sharp breath. Bilderberg, she said. Yes, I said. They watched us scouting around the Caesar Park Hotel, and they've been following us ever since. We have now been followed for 3 hours. I wasn't sure at first, so I stopped my car on the side of a deserted lane, and he stopped his car right in front of us. Can you imagine just how chilling that moment was? This is especially disconcerting because I'm from England and I'm not used to being spied on. Do you have Bilderberg's permission to be in Portugal? She said. Do they know you're here? No, I said. Bilderberg are very secretive, she said. They don't want people looking into their business. What are you doing here? I am essentially a humorous journalist, I explained. I am a humorous journalist out of my depth. Do you think it might help if we tell them that? From the corner of my eye, I saw Jim wind down his window. He leant his head out and blew an antagonizing, ladylike kiss at the Lancia. Hold on a second, I said. Jim, I said sternly, please stop that. I lowered my